Who will defend this country if not you and I? Think back to 55 and 56 BC, when ancient Britons were standing on the edge of the white cliffs of Dover, peering down at these mysterious ships that were coming in, led by Julius Caesar. An invasion force, an expeditionary invasion force, agreed, but to the ancient Britons, a people from afar who didn't look very welcoming, and nor were they. And so these ancient Britons lifted rocks and held spears and went down onto the beach to try and repel these invaders. And the invaders moved along, but eventually came on board. And although skirmishes happened, they were eventually repelled. They eventually left. They didn't invade for long. But Julius Caesar was crowned an emperor. And later, Claudius, in 43 AD, came back. And when he came back with a far bigger force, big ships that sailed across the English Channel. And on board were men, an army, horses and supplies. And they came ashore, and so the Roman invasion came about. And the Romans, they came and stayed for 400 odd years. They quashed the repelling Britons, but they brought with them some elements of civilization. They gave us roads, or improved our roads. They improved our aqueducts, or gave us aqueducts. They gave us cities. They gave us centres. They gave us administration on a large scale. No longer were we tribes fighting one another from hill forts. And the Romans hung around for 400 odd years, but eventually their empire began to collapse, and many of them returned back to their motherland, which made us weak. And other forces, Saxons and people from that side of Europe, could see the weakness, they could see the advantages, and they came. And they came over, and so did the Vikings. And soon the country was populated and invaded by such people. Nobody really stopped them. We don't know exactly how much of a battle went on to repel the Saxons. But a way of life developed for another 500 years. Farming, feudal system, trade. It wasn't a bad world. But some of the Vikings had gone down to Normandy and became Normans. And they looked across here with envious eyes, just as Martians once did in the H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, and decided that they would invade. And they put together their ships, the Normans. But Harold, our king, who was fighting off a Danish invasion up at Stamford Bridge, heard the news that William was coming, and he marched his men tirelessly down the Great North Road, presumably, and he battled them at a disputed place near Hastings. But unfortunately he lost, he died, and some say an arrow to the eye, others say otherwise. But either way, the Saxon force, the Anglo-Saxon force, lost, and the Normans came in with their castles and their laws. But they didn't invade in the same way as the Saxons had, by bringing in lots of people. They didn't invade in the same way as the Romans had. They were more of an administration. They didn't bring in huge armies. They took advantage of all they saw around them, the ancient Saxons, the farmers, and they took control. But over time, that control weakened and the people became one as generations and generations. They fought against the Welsh against the Scots. But at some point we became a united kingdom, where all the kingdoms worked pretty cohesively together to protect this island. And for 1,000 years we had relative peace. And then in the beginning of the 20th century, of course, we had the First World War, and more interestingly, the Second World War, in which another force wanted to invade us. They'd invaded across most of Europe, and they looked at us again, like those Martians, with envious eyes, determined to get across the English Channel. But we were determined not to. Something awakened in us. No, this island was precious. We wanted to defend it. We weren't going to put up with it. And despite the fact that many of those in Parliament were prepared to sign some form of peace treaty with Adolf Hitler and roll over, Winston Churchill decided no, we weren't. We would stand up to them. We would fight them on the beaches. We would do just as those ancient Britons in their blue woad back in BC 55. We would fight them and resist to the end. And our boys in blue took to the airs, and our whole backup of men and women in the factories supported them. And then people say that Russia had taken the attention of Hitler, and even though we'd been bombed and blitzed, and they may well have still come, the attention was changed. But I still say we fought and we stood up for our country, for we were not invaded, and the war took a different direction. And then, over the next 80 years to the present day, we softened. We became less interested in protecting our island. We became invaded in different ways. Americanism was one way, thanks to the Second World War and all the Americans that had come in halfway through to help us. We accepted the American way of life with hamburgers and baseball caps and baggy clothes and comfortable clothes, and we lost a lot of our stiff upper lip Englishness. But worse than that, we didn't seem to mind who came into this country. If they weren't waving spears and they weren't thrusting swords into us, we welcomed them in. After all, diversity is such a good thing, isn't it? But when you start bringing in significant numbers of people from different traditions and cultures and histories and ways of living, when you bring in those people in large numbers into your land and they don't integrate and don't become part of you, what happens to your own traditions, customs and culture? What happens to your own way of life? It starts to diminish. And when it diminishes and you have a multitude of different peoples from different parts of the world, all living together but in ghettos, in enclaves, with different ways of looking at things and different laws within their own system, you start to get a bit of unrest. But you lose that cohesion. You lose the thing that binds them together. A passion for their country, the patriotism, the essence that makes a country as a whole tick. And that seems to me is where we are, that we're just rolling over and letting whomever we want to come in. Small boats, little rubber boats with 40 or 50 blokes on them, mostly men. We just let them come. Come on in, come in, we'll put you up, we'll look after you. Of course they're going to come. There was a time when we would defend this island. We would stand there and repel and do our best. But not anymore, it would seem. So I ask again, who will defend this island, if not you and I?